had left off on the last session discussing basically the 1960s to the 1990s. And we had left off with you leaving the Communist Party basically over a million march in 1995. And so we had also talked about the fall of the Soviet Union, which represented the victory of the United States in the Cold War. And that was basically declared like the failure of socialism and the end of history and the hegemony of American imperialism. And with it, ideological consolidation around basically white values of neoliberalism and Western-style democracy. And that also meant the end of the world communist movement, and it triggered a weakening of the Communist Party in the United States, which then regressed to social democracy. And so for today, we want to discuss the period of the 1990s to today, primarily as a time of crisis. And we want to define it through a broken social contract of increasing poverty, unemployment, homelessness, and war. And just explicitly, we have to see this human suffering as the result of choices that have been made by the ruling elite to attack and to degrade the people. And so we were thinking about discussing like the 1990s and the 2000s as one sort of era of like the dominance of the American state and a period of ideological confusion when progressive movements were basically split and weakened, and they struggled to mount a strong challenge in general. And then the 2010s and 2020s as increasingly defined by a crisis of governance and a crisis of legitimacy. Where before, like, the state was seen as very powerful, but actually in the last decades, we've seen a weakening and a crisis of legitimacy. And so today, like, we talk about it all the time in free school, but the crisis is extremely acute, and we can feel it all around. There's a crisis of meaning and purpose, and there are questions of where we're going to go for the future. There's a lack of confidence and a clear positive vision for that. But we also see a clear division between the state and the ruling elite and the American people. And so we wanted to ask, you know, maybe the American people are more alike, more close together than before. And it becomes increasingly important to define the principles on which we can unite and actually have a people's movement for the future. And so we want to discuss how we've gotten to the present moment and how you're able to see it the way that we do in free school, because it's so important to the struggle for ideological clarity in this moment. And then we want to also discuss the future and the struggle to prepare for a remaking of the American people, which obviously is an ongoing process, and they're very big questions that we will continue to talk about in free school, but we want to touch on the basis for a new people's movement in this time and what will be necessary to achieve it. If there are basically new conditions or new logics or new ideas in the 21st century that have to be taken into consideration. And so we want to think about where leadership and the democratic capacity of the people can be found, and what ideas and vision of art and music and the category of civilization will actually push the struggle forward into the future. And so we want to think of it both in terms of the continuity of your life across all these years of struggle, but then also basically the break towards new ideas and new things in the 21st century especially. And so to start, we still want to go back to the 1990s and talk about that, because I think we touched on a lot of things, but we want to draw out more of the details, and then we want to go forward into like the temple days and free school for a large portion of the interview. Okay, and so, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, like to go back a little, to even talk about basically, so I want to start by asking, you lived through this period of ascension, these great revolutionary movements that were actually making gains for the people, the Black freedom struggle as a whole, but then, you know, you also had all of the anti-colonial, the entire world state. So you had that revolutionary period. And then in this country, even starting with the 70s, after King's assassination, a lot of those gains were actually attacked by the state, with de-industrialization and so on. And I wanted to start by asking you what that felt like, basically living through that period of revolution and then seeing the counter-revolution mounted against the people and what effect it had on, like, you know, even in the first interview session when we talked about the Black social system, you described basically seeing everybody around you have a job, belong to a union, go to work, come back from work every day. But what was the effect, the human effect of this counter-revolution as it was felt in, you know, the lives, the day-to-day lives of people?
Well, it's interesting. I was born 2 years before Indian independence and 4 years before the Chinese Revolution. Uh, and I guess I was 5 years old when the war in Korea began, and about 14 years old when the United States began its build-up in Vietnam. But I say this to say that by the middle of the 20th century, with the defeat of Nazism and Hitler and the defeat of Japan and China and Asia, a whole new world began. So even though, when I'm born I don't have an acute consciousness of the world that I live in, by the time I'm at least 10 years old, certainly by the time I'm 10, I am becoming conscious of the world. And, when I'm 10 years old, Emmett Till is assassinated. It was something very personal for every black person. We all felt it in a way that I don't think we had felt any other lynching or whatever, anything since then, by the way. And it was so impactful that Rosa Parks says that when she decided not to give her seat up, she was thinking about Emmett Till. So Emmett Till, I think, is killed in March or April, and Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in December, all of 1955. So I'm 10 years old, and I'm aware of all of this. In fact, I think by this time I'm very aware of the Chinese Revolution, because the US is always talking against it. And I think I was aware at that young age of Gandhi. I know the name of Krishna Menon was all over the place because he was kind of the UN ambassador. Nehru's name was everywhere. And so as a child, I guess I had this sense that the world would be changing for the better. Even though I'm not aware that I knew the names of Robeson or Du Bois because they were being attacked, but I do remember, as I said before, sitting in this very room with a television here, looking at the McCarthy hearings. Not that I was looking at them, but they were on, and I guess my mother was looking at them, and I'm, seeing this. So it's a split screen of these white men angry at the world and angry at the Chinese and angry at everybody because, even then it was very clear that they saw the freedom of the darker races as a conspiracy against white people. And I kind of knew it at 10. I think for me, by that time, if not before, I had, my identity was as a black person. It was no question about it. And all of my family were, of course, black, but working people. So I don't know anything else. I don't know, I have no concept of a world for me to live in that is not black, that is not working people. And I would say, as I have proceeded through life, it is that identity that remains with me. And I know you all see me, the way I talk sometimes, and you can see sometimes I'm sarcastic, sometimes I'm ironic sometimes, but you can sense that well, there's a certain anger, but that I don't believe and will not tolerate white men trying to bully me or any black person, white men talking any way they want to talk to me or black folk. And this is from childhood. Now, of course, when I enter into public schools, I went to integrated schools or formally integrated schools where we black children always knew that we were being treated differently and as less than. And this really became more clear when I went to high school, an elite high school, Central High School, where literally I would not have gotten in had my parents not gone there and demanded it. But they reluctantly allowed me in, and you knew all the time that they didn't want you. And I think, this is that peculiar feeling that only black people have. Because you live in a country where you're supposed to be a citizen, but everything you do or every experience you have, you're treated as though you're not an equal citizen. And so it's quite natural that there be a civil rights movement. And we all accepted it as a natural development. And see, the other thing is, and this king can never be underestimated, the way he presented the cause of black people gave black people a lot of pride. He was not just presenting our case, but with such eloquence, with such, oratorical elegance, even poetry. So now by this time, my family had always been Baptist from their time in South Carolina. And I think I told you all that my grandmother, her church was Mars Chapel Baptist Church, and they had one Mars Chapel Baptist Church in North Philadelphia, and the main church was in Greenwood, South Carolina. But my mother, she decides that she will join another Baptist church, which turns out to be a far more progressive one, a younger pastor, and a pastor that is linked to the social movement and civil rights movement, and that's Zion Baptist Church. And that made a lot of difference. Now, I recently found out, first of all, that Du Bois mentioned Zion Baptist Church in the Philadelphia Negro. And the church was founded in the late 1880s, and the first church, and I knew about the Zion Baptist Church right around the corner from here. But we didn't join it until it had moved up to Broad and Venango. And this dynamic preacher who preached the social gospel, the gospel of struggle and liberation, and so in spite of everything else, I had my family, I had the community, and I had the church. And for us, there were so many things to do, even as children. There would be the white world, but then we'd have our thing. We would have Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts and summer camps, but everything was segregated. Everything. Except we would go to school, integrated schools, but then everything else was segregated. As a Cub Scout, only black Cub Scouts. Boy Scout, everything was separated. When we went to summer camp, all black. So, but then, we're fighting for freedom. And it all seemed very natural. I think it gave us a strong sense of our identity, you know, and I think I still have that. Yeah, and a sense of pride. I mean, let me just say, then you can ask me something else. You know, well, you all see it in a different way, of pop culture designed to trivialize and put black people down. Now, the difference, well, it's not that difference. Back then, and this goes back to the 20s and 30s, where Hollywood was built upon films, what they call race films, that portrayed black people as ignorant, as dumb, as lazy, and so on and so forth. And so this was all over the place. And you can't say it didn't affect us, it did. And so we had to therefore have these institutions that, you know, asserted pride and dignity and that type of thing. And the church was very pivotal, and a church like Zion Baptist Church, with this dynamic preacher and his connection to the civil rights movement, if I think back upon it, it meant everything to me, and even up to this day.
What I'm hearing you say is also that, because I was trying to draw attention to this period of de-industrialization and, you know, with the crime bill, this mass incarceration. And I think my question was like, oh, what did that look like? That's not
Okay.
right. But
Yes.
what I'm hearing you say is it was never possible to take for granted that the state would actually, like, it could actually ever be counted on to want to keep those gains that had been won by the struggle.
Let me tell you this. I would say at a certain point, and this is as the 50s turn to the 60s, and the Great March on Washington, I think most black people believe that the state would now be our ally. You know what I'm saying? That in effect we had won the battle to change the country. And I think you're right about this, that it was short-lived, just like Reconstruction. And there were multiple things that conspired against us. We couldn't see all of this then, you know? But of course, de-industrialization, which begins in the 70s, which becomes more intense in the 80s. But with the death of Martin Luther King, the rise of political movements among white folk to argue, and I hope y'all can understand this, that our getting our civil rights was taking something from white people. Can you imagine this? That, in other words, black people had victimized white people. Now, I'm trying to figure out all of my responses to this. I'd have to think about it more, but you can just imagine, by this time, by the 1970s, I'm in my mid-20s. I'd gone to Lincoln, I'd graduated from Lincoln, I'd gotten this fellowship to go to the University of the Sciences. I'm arrested on a really trumped up charges, a COINTELPRO operation, and I guess my sense is that we have to continue the struggle. I think a big influence on me were the killings of two friends of mine, Fred Hampton, and John Huggins, who we were students together at Lincoln. And I guess, you know, the 60s with the assassinations, you were very aware that the struggle for black rights or black liberation would face the violence of the state and white people.
Yeah, I feel like some of this you can see in Winston's strategy for a black agenda too in '73, where he makes a point to basically defend King and then also I think talk at some length about the repression of the state in all of that. And so I think I wanted to ask, like, some of these processes, like when you mentioned the decade of assassinations, it's very obvious in the moment that it's an attack on the movement. But things like de-industrialization and like growing homelessness and unemployment, I guess how long did it take to really feel like the deep impacts of that? And in some ways, like what was the Communist Party and Winston's response to this changing situation that ultimately like would basically lead to like the crime bill in the 1990s and you writing criminalization as the new face of racism? Like, did it feel like it was part of a bigger picture, or was it something that you had to sort of look back on later on?
First, one thing, just on King, and this is in the Black Civil Rights Movement, this is key to the future of the Communist Party. And Winston, and you're right, Winston elevated it to the center of the struggle of the American people. Others didn't see it that way. And those who did not see it that way, I think, could not sustain even a party based upon Marxism-Leninism in this country. But, you see, once I joined the Communist Party, many things came together, many dots were connected, and then I had strong mentorship, all the difference in the world. Not just Winston, but others. Mainly black people, but others. I could name a number of them, of course, Hyman Loomer. There were others, and I'd never met whites like this, but you know, by the time I'm in the Communist Party and all the things we talked about before, I'm understanding the world better, I'm understanding the US economy better. I did not understand what was in front of us as counter-revolution. I still felt that the winds behind us, coming from that civil rights movement and so on, could be consolidated at a higher level of struggle. It did not occur. It didn't occur. And this is a study of dismantling of movements, manipulation of people, dividing of people. Now here I'm talking essentially about black people and all of the ideological things that were thrown at us. And this is why Winston's book is so important. Because, you see, if you only had a class understanding, you could just say, oh, the working class is under attack. But it was not the whole working class. It was black folk. And Winston was defending, and I say it all the time, and you know, it's just, the more I say it, the more concretely I see it. Winston was saying that from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King, his trilogy was Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King. And that, as the iconic figures from the anti-slavery to the anti-imperialist struggle. And I know, I don't even have to speculate, that there were mainly white people, but also many black people in the left and in the party who did not accept it, what he was saying. They had this paternalism about the civil rights movement, that Martin Luther King was a nice man, a good man, a peaceful man, but they didn't see him as a revolutionary. But they had no alternative, and there was no objective alternative to the black movement. And by being weak in their understanding of the black movement, they could not fight for white people and white workers to have an understanding of it and the leadership of black people. They just, and so you end up with kind of what we see today. I think we're in a better situation today than then. But then you got that, and then the economy changes. And de-industrialization, while hitting black people the hardest, hits the entire working class. The trade union leadership, it was primarily white. And as we talked before, black trade union leaders formed a coalition of black trade unionists. There were other things, the revolutionary union movements in Detroit in the auto industry. But most of the leaders of unions, as is the case today, were white. And you see, this is what is kind of infuriating when you think about it. It's not that they're under such assault, especially then, that they could not have broadened their agenda to include the attacks upon black people. Right. You know, they would always default to this, we're just trade unionists and we have to fight for our workers. And by our workers, they only meant their union.
Their bargaining unit.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's such bad faith.
Right.
And, but then, you know, as a fallback position, they would, their political work was to support the Democratic Party. Now, this is crucial because there were those in the party who, under the guise of uniting the working class and so on, followed this line of the trade unionists without resistance, without criticism of it. And this, it's kind of a groveling before white trade unionists and it was not the same attitude that black trade unionists had towards white trade unionists in the unions that they were in together. But some in the party, you know, lowered the ideological, really the moral level, and they were able to live with and tolerate those machinations of many of the white trade union leaders. I would say the majority of them. And that included Zionism, especially in the teachers' union.
Wow.
Yep. The American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest unions, who, especially in the struggle in New York over community control of schools, you know what I'm saying? A democratic demand. The United Federation of Teachers, which was the arm of the American Federation of Teachers in New York, came out against the black community. And And this was also mixed in with Zionism. The American Federation of Teachers, the United Federation of Teachers, are among the most racist and Zionist in the trade union movement. And they, and it was a guy named Albert Shanker, and they attacked this community in Brooklyn, who was saying that community people should have something to say about what their children are taught, how their children are taught, how their schools are conducted. And these white teachers attacked them in the name of trade unionism. But I say that to say, you know, this is a complicated question. I guess I've said this to you all before. A person at one period could be a courageous fighter for black people's rights, and a few years later could be on the opposite side. And I would say, as far as I could see in the party, and the party was where I was operating primarily from throughout the 70s and 80s into the 90s, that there was a reason I was too young, too inexperienced. I could never identify the hesitancy. And this applied to Winston's book. This applied to the fight for solidarity with Africa. And I think a good part of it, I'm only speculating, because it's a mixture of many things, was that in Namesul, and I had written about this, that Israel was aligned with the apartheid regime in South Africa, and even was helping the apartheid regime to develop nuclear weapons. And of course, in 1975, the General Assembly of the UN passed a resolution declaring that Zionism was a form of racism and racial discrimination. And of course, I celebrated it, most black people celebrated it, and the Zionists, and I don't know how many Jews, it's, a lot of times, but they saw first of all, our support of the Arab nations in the 1967 war to be betrayal. We fought alongside you all in the civil rights movement, and now when it came to the existence of the state of Israel, you sided with the Arabs. Well, it was Israel that attacked the Arab states, not the other way around. And then when we celebrated the UN General Assembly resolution, and when we, in fighting apartheid, pointed out that Israel was one of the main backers of apartheid in South Africa. And how could they claim to be liberal and anti-racist in this country when doing, what they were doing in South Africa? Now, I just want to make this point. How all of this manifested in the life of the party. And, as I told you before, in any kind of complex organization, you're going to have factions. In a communist party, the point is that factions do not attempt to establish a separate group, a separate line, that you might have a faction, but once a vote is taken, you go along with the majority. But on the question of black folk, there were many problems. One was the question of, are black people more important than the working class? Another thing was, the Jews have been allies of black people. So this idea of the Black-Jewish alliance, which in some ways went back to the 1930s, was that still applicable? which, by the way, is part of the reason that I left the party over the Million Man March, because the subtext was that you can't support the Million Man March because it would upset the so-called Black Jewish Alliance. Now, there was a Black Jewish Alliance controlled by Jews and mainly, quote, civil rights leaders and politicians and some academics who were paid off and thus controlled by this Zionist lobby and so on. It was even present then. And but that affected the internal life of the party. Not spoken loudly, but then with the collapse of the world movement, the world communist movement, all of this comes to the fore. And if you ask me, I can give you some concrete examples. But to your point quickly, de-industrialization, and then the because see, by this time, by the late 60s and into the 70s, the major leaders of the civil rights movement, I'm talking about Coretta Scott King, Diane Nash, C.T. Vivian, Ralph Abernathy, Joseph Lowry, the whole leadership of SCLC had literally begun to merge with the World Peace Council. And this is why I'll say this over and over again. Roma Chandra is a major figure. You know, because first of all, he understood them and they understood him. He was sensitive and really to the Black movement, I think, more than to any other group of people. You know, and so almost the whole leadership of SCLC is aligned to the World Peace Council and the fight for world peace as part of the fight against racism and poverty. And that was conscious. So when Coretta Scott King comes forward with a peace budget, a jobs budget, it's all also wrapped in this thing of world peace. And so, but on the other side, this is very important, you get the ultra-left movement. You know, the Panthers had gone too far. Huey P. Newton, I think, tried to bring them back to the people. Elbridge Cleaver and the New York Panthers decided that the only path was armed insurrection and armed struggle. So the Panthers are split. Huey is incapable of leading through this very difficult ideological terrain. And, you know, he felt betrayed. He felt that he had put his life on the line for the party, and people who had not done as much were betraying him, you know, all of that. But then you got the rise of cultural nationalism. Huge problem, even up to this day. A lot of what you see as Black militancy or Black revolution is really nothing but 1970s cultural nationalism reconfigured for this time. So the claim that King was an assimilationist, the civil rights movement was a failure, that it ideologically disoriented a lot of young Black people. This at the same time that de-industrialization and the federal and state governments cutting back on funding for things like education. So it throws us back. You got legal rights, but there's no substance to it. Then you get, like I told you, the American Federation of Teachers attacking Black communities and saying that the fight to protect the rights of teachers had to also be a fight against the rights of Black communities. This was their brand of unionism. And I would say, unfortunately, or fortunately, it was Winston and black folk that stood up to it.
Yeah.
Everybody did not agree with that.
Right.
But then I would say by the 1980s, and I was not aware of it, by the beginning of the 1980s and the election of Reagan, we are being pushed back and set back in ways that we could not imagine. We were losing. But I, for one, didn't accept it. I thought we could fight it on.